There is a very short list of people to whom I could write the line, "I expect I'll be sprung from jail any day now. Prepare the guest room. I'm going to need a place to stay." I like this version of Paul. Paul can be hard to take. He's curmudgeonly at times, sarcastic, even rude. But here in his letter to Philemon, he sounds a little bit hopeful, a little less strident. The way I have it figured, he must have been pretty good friends with Philemon, because inviting oneself over after getting out of the big house does tend to suggest a certain level of closeness. Yes, I think I would like this version of Paul, because if we're being honest, I don't always like Paul. I know some of you feel the same way. It's hard to like someone whose words have been used to enslave your people, or to shut you up, or to shut you out. There are a great number of Christians who have legitimate complaints about the way Paul has been used through the years. Sometimes I wonder, if Paul were to reread his correspondence, if there wouldn't be a few things he might write differently, knowing they would be quoted for years to come. I mean, I've sent one or two emails that I wished I could recall the instant I sent them. And what's more, Paul wrote about things that matter to people. He wrote about things like money and sex and friendship. And he was honest to a fault. That can be a problem sometimes, can't it? We don't always like it when people are truly honest with us, do we? I mean, there has to be a certain level of friendship present, a certain level of trust to get to genuine honesty, doesn't there? I mean this. I will tell you if you have a hunk of spinach caught between your teeth. That is the sort of guy that I am. I hope you will do the same thing for me. But that's easy. Once I was sitting in my office working when a woman in my congregation walked into my office with the zipper on her pants down, and I couldn't bring myself to say a word to her. So when she was leaving to walk next door to my assistant's office, I jotted down a note on the slip of paper and folded it up and handed it to her and said, "Would you please take this to Cheryl? It will save me a lot of work." The note to my assistant read, "Tell Cookie that her fly is down." Sometimes it's hard to say the things that matter, isn't it? My friend, American church historian Peter Hobby, has said that sometimes people value the friendship more than they value the friend. It takes a certain level of friendship, a certain level of trust to be truly honest with one another, doesn't it? It's hard to tell the truth sometimes. Like I said, I'll tell you if you have a hunk of spinach caught between your teeth. But if you want marital advice from me, you're going to have to ask me for that. I think you have to be pretty good friends to say, "I'm sending your slave back to you, and I expect you to do right by him." Those slavery passages in the Bible are hard ones, aren't they? Those passages, as well as the ones about women keeping silent in church and about homosexuality, they are the ones that give Paul a bad reputation some of the time, I think. The truth is, sometimes you have to look through the text to see the gospel. I know that's the case with the slave passages of the Bible and with the sexuality passages and with the gender passages. We have to look through the words until we find the gospel. Now, the gospel is there to be seen. Sometimes we just have to keep looking until we find it. We have to keep reading the Bible until we find the good news, because only when it is good news is it the gospel. This letter is a piece of work. Paul wrote to Philemon, "Now I want you to treat Onesimus as your brother." I want this. I could command you to do it, but rather I would like to see you do it because, well, everything's changed, hasn't it? Paul lays it on thick. Now, I'm not going to tell you you have to do it because you haven't asked me, but here's what I would do. Oh, and by the way, if Onesimus has wronged you in any way, just charge it to my account. He was good to me while I was in jail. Just charge it to me, and we won't say anything about you owing me your very life. Think nothing of it. Paul and Philemon must have been really good friends. Perhaps they were good enough friends that Philemon knew what Paul was preaching in Galatia. Paul was preaching a message that everything has changed. There is no longer Jew nor Greek. There is no more slave nor free. There is no longer male and female. Everything has changed. As a runaway slave, Onesimus had earned a harsh sentence. He was subject to beatings and imprisonment, perhaps even death. That's how tyranny works. You have to keep the oppressed down. If you don't make examples out of the mischief makers, others will get ideas. Philemon's friends would have considered it his duty to society to see that Philemon was punished. But Paul said to him instead, "Philemon, you are a Christian now. Everything has changed. In Jesus Christ, there is neither Jew nor Greek, slave nor free, male and female. Everything has changed." We say that every week. Do you realize that? We pray, "Forgive us our debts as we forgive our debtors," because we believe that everything can change. That's the sort of change Paul is talking about, the kind of change that leads us to forgive as we have been forgiven. That's what the grace of God does. It opens the possibility that everything can change. Now, I don't mean to meddle in your life, but maybe for a few of you, something needs changing. If grace ever seems empty to us, it's usually because we've succumbed to the belief that nothing can change. It happens all sorts of different ways that we come to believe that nothing can ever change. It is sometimes a lesson learned over time, over and over again, like an oft-repeated lie that begins to warp the reality of our lives. Perhaps we come to believe that we don't deserve God's grace, despite the fact that grace by definition is lavished on the undeserving. We think that we don't deserve to be loved the way we want to, because we have been treated wrong for so very long that we become used to it and think that that is the way that love works. Don't you think that needs changing? Or maybe we've come to believe that behavior is destiny. Maybe we believe, I've never been able to stop drinking before, so I'll never be able to do it anyway. May as well pour another. You think maybe that needs changing? Or maybe we've come even to believe that economics drive our reality. We've become so trapped in debt that we believe we can never get out, and so just open another credit card and keep on spending until it all comes crashing down. Do you think maybe that needs changing? Or perhaps we've come to believe that social structures will never change. Onesimus was born a slave, but I'm sure he thought he would die a slave. Maybe that needs changing, or at least Paul thought so. The good news of the gospel is that everything can change. I know many of you have faced moments in your life where in an instant everything changed. I certainly have. The truth of the gospel is that when everything changes, that is when God's grace that has been lavished on us begins to flow through us. The longer I am a minister, the more I come to believe that the gospel does not exist to preserve very much at all. Some things do bear preservation, to be sure, but as often as not, the question needs to be asked, did Jesus really die to keep that in place? That's a salient question because the grace of God is always a costly grace. God doesn't deal in cheap grace. So the question is, did Jesus really die so that Onesimus could remain a slave? Paul thought not. So he wrote to Philemon. Or perhaps the question was, did Jesus die to preserve a status quo where some gain wealth upon wealth and others struggle to have even enough food to make communion? Paul thought not. So he wrote a letter to the Corinthians. Or perhaps the question is, did Jesus die so that Jews and Gentiles could go right on segregating themselves from one another? Paul thought not. So he wrote a letter to the Galatians. The heart of the gospel is the promise that everything can change through God's grace. I'm reminded of a story I heard a while back about a visiting professor who had stayed overnight on a Saturday night in an unfamiliar city so that he could save on his airfare. After staying over, the visiting professor got up on Sunday morning and inquired at the front desk if there was a church which he could attend, and they notified him of a small church which was just a short walk away. It was the sort of place, this professor said, where it was clear that the members had built it brick by brick themselves and they loved it deeply. So he came into the church, sidled into a pew and waited for church to begin. He wrote that when the time for the sermon came, the professor noted the preacher was at best ungainly to look at. He was physically very big and his head was misshapen and he had patchy hair all over his skull. His eyes were filmy and he had to hold the Bible very, very close to his face to be able to read it. As he spoke, the sinews on his neck stood out and it became clear that he had learned to speak as an adult. But soon, he said, he lost all consciousness of the man's appearance as he began to preach on the text of 1 Corinthians 13. That's the one where Paul says the greatest of these is love. The sermon, he said, was C-grade at best, neither poetic nor prophetic, but rather, he said, full of love. The preacher extended love as he preached, and the congregation gave it right back. And how is it, he wondered, in God's providence that this creature who is so unattractive on the outside has come to have this quality on the inside? So the preacher lingered after the sermon. The professor lingered after the sermon to speak to the preacher. And as he was doing so, he overheard a woman say, "I wish I could have known your mother." And the preacher replied, "My mother's name is Grace." When it was his turn to talk, he said, "That's an interesting reply you gave the woman." And the preacher replied, "Is it? When I was born, I was put up for adoption with the county, and as you can see, nobody wanted to adopt me. So I went from foster home to foster home. And I must have been about, 16 or 17 when I saw some young people going into a church, and I wanted to be with the young people, so I went in. And that's where I met grace, the grace of God. In the grace of God, anything can change. This table here is where we come to meet the grace of God. And when that grace makes change in us, that grace flows through us and out, blessing everyone whom we encounter. Now you remember what my friend Peter said about valuing the friend even more than the friendship. I am sure that Paul knew that with all of this change, Philemon could be reasonably anxious about the direction things might go. Sometimes people don't understand when the gospel has made a change in your life. They may be skeptical of that change. They may even be hostile to that change. And so Paul had obviously thought this through, and he had drawn the conclusion that Philemon might need a friend. He might need a little help staying the course. Friends know when it is time to show up, which is why I think that perhaps the most important verse in Philemon, after everything Paul has said about the gospel and Onesimus, is this one last line. One more thing. Prepare the guest room. I'll be there soon.